What happens when an HOA tries to steal a farmer's easement? They lose their gate, their road, and their dignity. This is why you always check the deed before you start a war with someone who owns a backhoe. The sanctity of a curated lifestyle is something the unrefined simply cannot grasp. To someone like Jackson Miller, a road is just a means to get from point A to point B, usually while kicking up enough dust to ruin a professional exterior paint job. But to those of us on the board of the Whispering Pines Estates, a road is a red carpet. It is the first impression of a meticulously managed ecosystem where chaos is neutralized by the power of a well-drafted fine. When I stepped into the role of HOA president, I didn't just take a title. I took a vow to protect the visual harmony of our 32 custom-built Mediterranean villas. We aren't just a neighborhood. We are a brand. And brands do not include rusted John Deere tractors rattling past the fountain at 6:00 a.m. The Miller farm had been a thorn in our collective side since the developers first broke ground. Old Man Miller had refused to sell his 50-acre parcel, leaving this jagged, unrefined square of agriculture right against our northern perimeter. For years, we tolerated it because the old man was quiet. But when he passed and Jackson took over, the frequency of the infractions became intolerable. Jackson didn't understand that, though. Historic access road he used was no longer a dirt track through the woods. It was now Whispering Pines Boulevard, a private thoroughfare lined with imported Italian cypress trees and cobblestone-edged gutters. Every time Jackson drove his flatbed truck through our entrance, he brought the reality of the working world into our sanctuary of leisure. He brought the scent of diesel and the literal weight of mud, which would cake onto our asphalt and dry into unsightly brown streaks. I remember the specific Tuesday morning that pushed me over the edge. I was standing on my balcony with a glass of lemon water, admiring the way the morning mist sat on the community putting green, when the roar of a multi-ton harvester shattered the silence. It didn't just vibrate the air. It vibrated the very soul of our community standards. I watched in horror as the harvester squeezed through our gate, which was designed for Range Rovers, not industrial machinery, and narrowly missed the stone pillar that bears our gold-leafed insignia. It was an act of aggression. It was a statement that his work was more important than our peace. I immediately called an emergency executive session of the board. We met in the clubhouse, surrounded by the scent of lavender diffusers and the soft hum of the climate control, to discuss the existential threat posed by the Miller property. The legalities seemed clear to us at the time, or at least we made them clear through the sheer force of our communal will. We reviewed the bylaws, specifically Section 4.2 regarding nuisance and aesthetic disruptions. While Jackson claimed he had a deeded easement, we argued that the easement was for agricultural transit, a term we decided was outdated and superseded by our private road maintenance agreement. We weren't just being difficult. We were being stewards. We were curators of a specific vision. To allow a farmhand to use our private infrastructure for his commercial gain without contributing to the reserve fund for repaving was, in my view, a form of theft. We spent hours debating the thickness of the wrought iron we should use for the new security gate. We wanted something that sent a message. You do not belong. We chose a design called the Fortress, featuring vertical spikes and a matte black finish that screamed exclusivity. We decided that the keypad codes would only be distributed to registered homeowners whose accounts were in good standing. Since Jackson wasn't a member of the HOA, much to his benefit, he thought he wouldn't receive a code. We framed it as a security upgrade. After all, with the rise in rural vagrancy, how could we be sure that a tractor wasn't just a clever disguise for someone looking to scout our homes? The letters we sent Jackson were masterpieces of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. We informed him that due to structural concerns regarding the weight limits of the internal road network, all vehicles exceeding 6,000 pounds were strictly prohibited. We knew his truck weighed more than that empty. We told him that any further use of Whispering Pines Boulevard would be met with a $500 per instance trespassing fee. We were building a legal and physical wall to protect our property values, convinced that the law of the land was secondary to the law of the association. I spent my afternoons walking the perimeter, imagining how much more beautiful the entrance would look once the Miller problem was solved. I envisioned a world where the only sounds were the soft whir of electric golf carts and the occasional pop of a tennis ball. We were creating a utopia. And in utopia, there is no room for the grit of the earth or the people who move it. We truly believed that by cutting him off, we were simply pruning a dead branch to let the rest of the tree flourish. We felt powerful, justified, and utterly superior, never once stopping to look at the old survey maps buried in the county archives. We were so busy looking at the beauty of our own gates that we forgot to check who actually owned the ground they were anchored in. To us, the Miller property was just a background, a blur on the horizon that needed to be managed, silenced, and eventually, we hoped, sold off to a developer who understood the importance of a uniform roof shingle color. We were the kings of our cul-de-sacs, and we were certain that our kingdom was impenetrable. The fundamental problem with people like Jackson Miller is that they possess a staggering lack of appreciation for the nuances of modern luxury. When I hand-delivered the final notice taped to a stake driven into the mud at his property line, because I certainly wasn't going to risk my luxury SUV's suspension on his unpaved driveway, I expected a sense of somber realization. Instead, I was met with that infuriating, slow blinking silence that only people who work with their hands seem to master. Jackson stood there, wiping grease off his knuckles with a rag that looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine since the Eisenhower administration, and had the audacity to tell me that he had work to do. Work. I tried to explain to him that work is what happens in a high-rise office with glass walls and a digital infrastructure. What he was doing was merely a hobby that involved a lot of noise and a complete disregard for the tranquility of his betters. I stood there, adjusting my designer sunglasses, and laid it out for him. The Whispering Pines Estates was moving toward a frictionless aesthetic experience. This meant no more dirt, no more noise, and certainly no more 1998 heavy-duty pickup trucks rattling the windows of the Sterling family's breakfast nook. He had the gall to mention an easement again, citing some dusty document from 1924 as if a piece of paper signed by a man in overalls a century ago had any standing against a modern board of directors with a legal retainer. I told him quite firmly that the world has changed since his grandfather's time. We have a Pilate studio now. We have a communal fire pit with a gas-powered ignition. We do not have space for agricultural transit. The sheer entitlement of the man was breathtaking. He actually suggested that since his family had been using that specific strip of land to reach the highway for 3 generations, he had a historical right to continue doing so. I had to laugh, a controlled, sophisticated laugh. Of course, I informed him that rights are things you earn through compliance and community participation. He wasn't paying the $450 monthly assessment for road maintenance, yet he expected to use the asphalt that our residents' hard-earned bonuses had paid for. It was peak working class audacity. I told him, Jackson, if your little farm is so successful, surely you can afford to build your own road through the swamp on the backside of your property. He pointed out that the swamp was a protected wetland and that building a road there would cost $500,000 and take 3 years of EPA permits. I simply shrugged. That sounded like a Jackson problem, not a Whispering Pines problem. Our problem was the mud. Our problem was the fact that when he hauled his hay, the stray stalks would blow into the gutters of the mansions nearby, creating a mess that the landscaping crew had to be paid extra to clear. It was a drain on our resources. I watched him look toward our new, magnificent wrought iron gate, the one he didn't have the code for, and I felt a surge of righteous triumph. I told him that the gate was a symbol of our standards. It wasn't just about keeping people out. It was about keeping the wrong energy out. He didn't
Stop!
yell.
You can't come in here!
Scream.
This is private property. You need to leave. I'm just doing my job.
Incredibly disrespectful.
But I have a
He
delivery.
said,
I'm sorry, no
sure about
exceptions.
this?
Please turn
Diane,
around. This is
You
ridiculous.
sure you want to play the property
As you can
line
see, the
game?
fields are
I
perfect
told
for
him
development.
My name is
Impressive.
President
What's the
Miller
acreage?
About 250.
Yes.
Let's walk.
I was absolutely sure. I reminded him that we had the best HOA attorney's money could buy men who wore suits that cost more than his tractor. I told him that if he tried to force the gate or tamper with the keypad, we would have him arrested for domestic terrorism or, at the very least, destruction of private property. He just nodded, which I took as a sign of submission. I assumed he would slink away and start the arduous process of selling his land to someone who would actually do something useful with it, like build a boutique golf course or an equestrian center for the wealthy. I spent the rest of the week gloating to the board during our wine and cheese mixer. We toasted too. The new silence. We discussed how the air felt cleaner, how the birds seemed to chirp with more clarity now that the low-frequency hum of a diesel engine wasn't polluting the atmosphere. We felt like we had successfully defended a fortress. We were the guardians of the gate, the protectors of the pristine. Every time I drove past the Miller property line, I looked for signs of his defeat. I expected to see a for sale sign or perhaps a U-Haul. Instead, I saw nothing. For 2 weeks, the farm was eerily quiet. I assumed he was sitting in his kitchen, staring at his bills and realizing that he was trapped. I even considered, in a moment of extreme charity, offering him a one-day pass to move his belongings out, provided he used a professional moving company with clean, white trucks. I felt a sense of magnanimous power. I was the person who had finally tamed the wild element that dared to border our paradise. I told the neighborhood children that they no longer had to fear the big scary trucks when they were riding their motorized mini Teslas. I was a hero in Lululemon. I had no idea that while I was busy celebrating our victory in ordering more custom, no commercial vehicles signage, Jackson wasn't sitting in his kitchen at all. He was at the county clerk's office. He was talking to surveyors. He was doing something that people with real, tangible land do, is checking the ground truth. But in my world, the ground is just something you cover with expensive sod. I didn't care about the dirt. I cared about the image. And that, I would soon learn, was the most expensive mistake the Whispering Pines Estates had ever made. I was so focused on the audacity of him wanting to use our road that I never once considered the audacity of where our road actually began. To me, his farm was an obstacle to be moved. To him, our entire entrance was a guest on his property. I spent those 2 weeks in a bubble of blissful ignorance, convinced that my HOA-mandated reality was the only one that mattered. The morning of the awakening started like any other with the irritatingly chirpy alarm on my sunrise simulating bedside clock and a sense of profound satisfaction that I had successfully scrubbed the grit of the Miller farm from our collective existence. I had spent the previous evening drafting a particularly scathing newsletter titled The Quiet Revolution, praising the board for its unwavering commitment to vehicular purity. I was in the middle of steaming my almond milk for a latte when the first text message arrived. Then another. Then the landline rang, a device I only keep for emergencies and calls from the club. It was Brenda from across the street, her voice reaching a frequency that only dogs and frustrated socialites can achieve. She wasn't just upset. She was hysterical. She kept screaming about and the delivery guy from Whole Foods crying in the ditch. I told her to breathe and reminded her that we have a strict policy against public displays of emotion. But my curiosity, or rather, my sense of duty to manage others, got the better of me. I threw on my designer tracksuit and headed toward the entrance of Whispering Pines Estates, fully expecting to find a minor fender bender or perhaps a fallen branch from one of our decorative maples. What I found instead was a scene that looked like a geopolitical standoff in the middle of our suburban paradise. As I rounded the final curve of Whispering Pines Boulevard, the majestic $10,000 wrought iron gate came into view. But it looked strangely small. It looked small because it was now framed by 2 massive, industrial-grade concrete barriers, the kind they use on interstates to stop runaway semi-trucks. These Jersey barriers were positioned exactly 3 inches outside our property line, right where our elegant asphalt driveway met the public county road. But that wasn't the worst of it. Between the barriers, Jackson Miller was sitting on his ancient, mud-caked tractor, idling the engine so that a thick, rhythmic cloud of diesel smoke drifted lazily over our gold-leafed community sign. He wasn't on our property. He was on a sliver of land that I had always assumed was the shoulder but which I was now seeing through a very different lens. There were 4 men with transit levels and orange vests standing around, and a massive flatbed truck was unloading even more concrete blocks. I marched up to the line, my phone already dialed to the non-emergency police dispatch. I didn't even wait for him to turn off the engine. I screamed over the roar of the tractor, demanding to know what unauthorized construction was taking place in the vicinity of a private residential zone. Jackson didn't jump. He didn't even look startled. He climbed down from the tractor with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a personal insult to my time. He reached into the pocket of his filthy work jacket and pulled out a laminated map that looked far too official for my comfort. He didn't hand it to me. He held it up like a holy relic. He pointed to a shaded rectangle that sat directly underneath our beautifully landscaped entrance islands, our stone pillars, and the first 40 feet of our private road. This here, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm, is the Miller Triangle. My great-grandfather didn't just have an easement to use your road. Diane, he owned the dirt the road was built on. When your developers put in this fancy entrance 20 years ago, they did it on a handshake deal with my dad that was never recorded in the new plat. They thought they could just absorb it because we were quiet farmers. I felt the blood drain from my face, replaced by a heat that I am sure clashed horribly with my tracksuit. I told him he was delusional. I told him that adverse possession or some other legal word I'd heard on a crime drama would surely protect us. He just smiled, a real, genuine smile that sent shivers down my spine. He told me that adverse possession requires hostile use, but since his father had given permissive use for decades, the clock had never started ticking, and as of 8:00 a.m. that morning, the permission was officially revoked. I looked past him and saw a line of cars forming. Mr. Henderson was in his Porsche, honking rhythmically. A school bus was idling behind him, unable to turn around. The Amazon driver Brenda had mentioned was actually sitting on the curb, head in his hands, because his GPS told him he had arrived. But a wall of concrete told him he was in a war zone. Jackson had essentially performed a surgical strike. He hadn't touched our gate. He had simply reclaimed the mouth of our community. We were like a beautiful, expensive bottle of wine that had just had a cork jammed into it by a man in a flannel shirt. The realization began to ripple through the gathered crowd of neighbors who had emerged from their homes like startled meerkats. "You can't do this," I shrieked, waving my phone at the surveyors. "This is a fire hazard. This is a kidnapping. We are being landlocked." One of the surveyors, a man who clearly had no respect for my position, looked up from his ledger and told me that, technically, we weren't landlocked, we could always walk out. We just couldn't drive our 2-ton German SUVs over Mr. Miller's private property without his express consent. And Mr. Miller, it seemed, was fresh out of consent. He told me he was planning on returning the land to its natural state, which apparently involved a lot of deep trenching for drainage purposes, right across our entrance. As the hydraulic lift on the flatbed began to hiss, dropping another 3-ton block of concrete with a bone-jarring thud, I realized that the rude awakening wasn't just about a blocked road. It was the crushing weight of the fact that all our bylaws, all our fines, and all our standards were built on a foundation of borrowed dirt. We were an empire without a border, and the barbarian at the gate wasn't trying to get in, he was simply closing his own front door. And we happened to be on the wrong side of it. The quiet revolution I had written about in the newsletter was happening. All right, but the silence wasn't the peaceful kind I had promised. It was the silence of 32 families realizing they were trapped in a very expensive, very pretty cage. The sheer, unadulterated chaos of the following 48 hours is something that no amount of HOA crisis management training could have prepared me for. By noon on that first day, the Whispering Pines Estates had transformed from a suburban sanctuary into a gilded pressure cooker. It wasn't just that we couldn't get our cars out. It was the psychological horror of being told no by someone who didn't even have a college degree in urban planning. I stood by the barriers for hours, my clipboard shaking, as the realization of our predicament filtered through the neighborhood like a toxic gas. We weren't just blocked. We were strategically neutralized. Jackson Miller hadn't just placed concrete. He had orchestrated a logistical decapitation of our lifestyle. The landlocked nightmare began in earnest when the lunchtime deliveries started to fail. We are a community that thrives on the gig economy. We don't cook in the traditional sense so much as we assemble organic ingredients delivered to our doorsteps by people we rarely look in the eye. But now, a line of frustrated couriers stood at the concrete wall, clutching bags of overpriced Thai fusion and artisanal salads, looking toward our houses as if they were peering across a moat at a medieval fortress. I watched from the safe side of the barrier as Mr. Thompson, a man who sits on the board of a major hedge fund, tried to bribe one of Jackson's workers to move a single block. He was waving $100 bill like it was a white flag of surrender. The worker didn't even look up from his sandwich. Jackson, meanwhile, had set up a lawn chair on his side of the line, his land, and was calmly sipping coffee from a thermos that looked like it had been through a war. Every time a resident approached the line to scream about their constitutional rights, Jackson would simply point to a newly erected sign that read, "Private property. No trespassing. No unauthorized paving. No exceptions." It was a mirror of our own language, turned against us with a lethal, ironic precision. The neighborhood quickly dissolved into a state of primitive panic. Mrs. Montgomery, who lives at the end of the cul-de-sac, began weeping because her poodles were scheduled for a fur sculpting appointment, and the groomer's van was currently performing a 16-point turn a quarter-mile down the road to escape the dead end. The social fabric of Whispering Pines began to fray at the seams. Normally, we are a people of polite nods and shared complaints about the color of mulch. But under the strain of being trapped, the residents turned on me. As president, I was the one who had assured them that the Miller nuisance was being handled. Now, they were surrounding me on the sidewalk, demanding to know why their property values were plummeting in real time. "My house is worth $2 million, shouted Bill from house number 12. "And right now, it's a $2 million birdhouse because I can get my Tesla to a charging station." He was right. Of course, the irony was that we had spent so much time obsessing over the curb appeal of our homes that we had completely ignored the curb itself. By the second day, the situation turned from inconvenient to dire. The trash pickup was canceled. The sight of our custom-colored rolling bins sitting full on the curbs was a visual assault I could barely withstand. It looked like a normal neighborhood. It looked like common sprawl. The true horror, however, was the sound. Jackson had decided that since he was reclaiming the land, he needed to begin a soil erosion project. This involved a rented backhoe and a series of deep, jagged trenches cut directly into the asphalt on his side of the line. The screech of metal on pavement echoed through our valley, a mechanical scream that signaled the end of our peace. He wasn't just blocking the road. He was destroying the very idea of it. I tried to call the sheriff, but when the deputy arrived, he spent 20 minutes looking at Jackson's surveys and then shrugged. "It's a civil matter, ma'am," he told me, his tone bordering on patronizing. "He's on his own land, and he's not touching your structures. If you want to cross his property, you'll need a court order or his permission." Permission. The word felt like ash in my mouth. We were the ones who gave permission. We were the ones who granted architectural variances. To be at the mercy of a man who wore a trucker hat was a reversal of the natural order so profound it felt like the end of days. As night fell on the second evening, the nightmare took on a surreal quality. The streetlights of Whispering Pines, which we had spent $30,000 to upgrade to a soft amber glow, illuminated a row of parked cars that would never move. We were a graveyard of luxury vehicles. I walked the perimeter with a flashlight, feeling like a sentry in a failing outpost. I saw neighbors peeking through their expensive curtains, their faces pale with the realization that they were effectively stranded. We couldn't even order an Uber. One brave soul tried to drive his SUV across the manicured lawn of the common area to bypass the gate, but he immediately bottomed out in a decorative drainage swale we had installed last spring. Jackson just watched from his porch, a shadow among the trees. probably laughing at our inability to navigate the very earth we claim to rule. The most galling part was the board emergency Zoom we held at midnight. Usually, these meetings are focused on things like the acceptable height of a mailbox. But this time, the tone was apocalyptic. Brenda suggested we airlift supplies in. Mr. Sterling suggested we sue Jackson into the literal Stone Age. But our lead counsel, who had finally looked at the deeds with a sober eye, silenced the room. He has the superior title. The lawyer whispered, sounding defeated. He doesn't just own the road. He owns the utility access points. If he keeps digging those trenches, he's going to hit the main water line for the entire subdivision. And since it's on his land without a modern easement, we might not even be able to legally send a crew in to fix it. A cold shiver went through the board. We weren't just landlocked. We were about to be thirsty. The nightmare was no longer about property values or poodles. It was about survival in a prison of our own making. We had spent years building a wall to keep the world out, never realizing that Jackson Miller held the only key to the door we had so arrogantly slammed shut. The surrender began not with a bang, but with the pathetic, rhythmic tapping of my own loafers on the pavement as I walked, head bowed, toward Jackson Miller's property line. It was the third day of the Great Sequestration, and the atmosphere in Whispering Pines Estates had shifted from indignant outrage to a hollow, primitive desperation. The privacy we had prized so highly, the kind that costs 5 figures in annual dues and requires a background check for your lawn care provider, had become a suffocating shroud. Without the ability to leave, our exclusive community felt less like a resort and more like a high-end holding cell. The final straw hadn't been the trash pile up or the lack of DoorDash. It had been the water. When Jackson's soil erosion project reached a depth of 4 feet exactly where the municipal line crossed his panhandle, he had paused his work to consult with a soil specialist. In that pause, he had exposed the pipes. He didn't break them, that would be illegal. He simply pointed out that the pipes were trespassing on his land without a formal utility easement. And until a new agreement was reached, he couldn't guarantee that his heavy machinery wouldn't accidentally settle on them. I found Jackson sitting on the tailgate of his truck, eating an apple. He looked remarkably refreshed, likely because he hadn't spent the last 48 hours fielding 300 frantic emails about the legality of concrete barriers. I stood there, clutching a leather-bound folder containing the board's peace proposal, feeling the weight of 32 angry households on my shoulders. I tried to maintain my presidential posture, but it's hard to look authoritative when you've had to walk half a mile because your car is trapped in a driveway that costs more than the average American's life savings. I began by clearing my throat a refined, authoritative sound and told him that the board was prepared to be lenient. I told him we were willing to overlook his unorthodox behavior if he would simply move the barriers and allow life to return to normal. Jackson didn't even stop chewing. He just looked at me with those maddeningly clear eyes and said, "Normal for who, Diane?" "Normal for the people who tried to fine me into bankruptcy for driving a truck on a road my granddad built." I felt the sting of that comment, but I pushed forward. I opened the folder and presented our offer. We would give him a special agricultural permit to use the road, provided he kept his equipment clean. Jackson laughed aloud, boisterous sound that echoed off the stone pillars of our useless gate. He then reached into his own pocket and pulled out a single sheet of yellow legal paper. "I don't want your permits, Diane," he said. "I am not asking for your permission to exist next to you anymore. You are going to sign my terms, or I am going to turn that entrance into a permanent wildflower meadow. And I've already checked with the county. It's perfectly legal to rewild your own acreage." The price of our privacy was, as it turned out, total and complete capitulation. The terms were a laundry list of HOA humiliations. First, the $10,000 gate our pride and joy. The symbol of our status had to be dismantled and sold for scrap, with the proceeds donated to the local 4-H club. Jackson didn't want to keep it. He wanted an open road, and he wanted it wide enough for a combine harvester to pass through without scuffing its tires. Second, the HOA was required to pay for the full repaving of the Miller Triangle and the next 200 yards of his driveway, using industrial-grade asphalt that could withstand the weight of a fleet of tanks. Third, and perhaps most painfully, Jackson demanded a permanent and irrevocable covenant. This document, which I had to sign in front of a mobile notary he had already summoned to the site, exempted the Miller farm from every single HOA regulation. Past, present, and future. He could paint his barn neon pink. He could keep 100 roosters. He could run a chainsaw at 2:00 a.m. on a Sunday. We would have no recourse. We were essentially giving him a diplomatic embassy of unstandardized land right in the middle of our curated world. As I signed the papers, my pen felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I could see Brenda watching through binoculars from her upstairs window, her face a mask of horror. She knew, as I did, that the era of the Whispering Pines estates was over. We were now just the houses next to Jackson S. farm. The privacy we had tried to use as a weapon had been turned into a mirror, reflecting our own arrogance back at us. We had tried to exclude him from our world, only to realize that our world only existed because he allowed it to. Jackson folded the signed document, tipped his hat to me, and climbed back onto his tractor, with a roar of smoke that I no longer found unacceptable. He hooked a chain to the first concrete barrier and dragged it aside. The sound of the barrier scraping across the pavement was the sound of my ego being ground into the dust. Within minutes, the line of trapped cars began to move. People sped out of the neighborhood as if they were escaping a burning building, not even looking at me as they passed. I stood there on the newly liberated road, watching the dust settle on my expensive shoes. We had our road back. We had our water back. But the standards were gone. That evening, as if to drive the point home, Jackson parked a trailer full of steaming organic fertilizer right at the property line, caught in a breeze that blew directly toward the clubhouse where we were supposed to have our victory gala. No one complained. No one sent a fine. We just closed our windows, sat in our expensive, landlocked silence, and realized that sometimes the cost of keeping people out is that you eventually find yourself with no way to get back in. We were finally private, just as we had always wanted, but we had never felt more exposed. Gemini said, "If you love seeing HOA Karens get exactly what they deserve, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't miss the next time a property standard backfires spectacularly."